Victory on the battlefield is overrated. Empires don't collapse when they lose wars. They collapse when they can no longer afford them. Britain didn't rule the world because of its cannons or its soldiers. It ruled because it turned war into a financial system. While other empires fought until they bled dry, Britain learned something far more dangerous: how to stay in debt. Forever. This is not a story of heroic generals. It's a story of ledgers, bonds, and a system so resilient that it outlived every army it financed. And this is why Britain is so often misunderstood. And that's the part people miss. The same system that built Britain's empire also set the trap that ended it. And by the end, you'll see why America is now walking into the same trap. Right as the bill starts coming due, most people think Britain built its empire with ships, soldiers, and conquest. That's wrong. Britain did not dominate the world because it had the biggest army. It dominated because it learned how to survive war longer than anyone else. It is the story of endurance, of systems, of debt. Because in history, the power that lasts the longest is rarely the power that wins the most battles. It is the power that can afford to keep fighting. And no country understood this better than Britain. By the late 17th century, Europe was trapped in a permanent state of conflict. Religious wars, dynastic wars, colonial wars, trade wars. From the War of Spanish Succession to endless naval conflicts, peace had become the exception, not the rule. Spain still carried the illusion of gold-based power. France relied on massive standing armies and heavy taxation. The Dutch had pioneered modern finance, but their small size limited how far that system could scale. Every ruler faced the same brutal problem. How do you pay for a war that never truly ends? Armies consumed resources at an unprecedented rate. Navies required constant maintenance. Gunpowder, ships, food, wages, everything cost money, and war burned through it faster than any economy could naturally produce. Britain watched its rivals struggle, collapse, and recover, only to collapse again. And Britain made a different decision. Instead of trying to avoid debt, Britain chose to master it. In 1694, Britain was exhausted. Years of conflict had drained the treasury. The crown was running out of options. The solution was not a new tax, not a new conquest, not more plunder. It was the creation of the Bank of England. This was not simply a bank in the modern sense. It was a permanent financial engine designed to fund the state itself. For the first time, a government institutionalized long-term borrowing as a core strategy. Investors lent money to the state. In return, they received interest backed not by promises, but by taxation and law. They even created something unprecedented: consols, government bonds with no maturity date, no repayment of principal, only interest, paid forever. This was not just a financial instrument, it was a statement. Investors trusted Britain's future so deeply that they were willing to lend money, without ever expecting it back. They were betting not on a king, not on a war, but on the continuity of the state itself. This was the ultimate confidence signal, a declaration that Britain did not plan to survive the next decade, but the next century. Debt was no longer an emergency measure. It became permanent. And in that moment, war stopped being a crisis. It became a manageable expense. Britain had discovered something revolutionary. A state that can borrow reliably can outlast states that rely only on raw resources. France had larger armies. Spain had more land. But Britain had cheaper credit. That difference changed everything. Because war is not decided in a single battle. It is decided by logistics, supply lines, and endurance. Britain could raise money faster, borrow at lower interest rates, pay its soldiers consistently, build ships without exhausting the population. Every conflict became a test of financial stamina, and over time Britain simply outlasted its rivals, not because it was stronger, but because it could keep paying the bill. Think of Napoleon Bonaparte. He conquered nearly all of continental Europe. He had the battlefield genius, the momentum, the armies. Napoleon mocked Britain as a nation of shopkeepers. But while France looted conquered lands to pay its troops, Britain simply issued more bonds. France financed war through extraction. Britain financed war through credit. Napoleon did not lose because he ran out of strategy. He lost because he ran out of money. And Britain kept borrowing. Every year the war continued, France became weaker. Britain became more entrenched. The shopkeepers outlasted the conqueror. Britain's navy is often remembered as the symbol of its empire. But the navy was not the source of power. It was the product of it. A powerful navy protected trade routes. Protected trade reduced risk. Reduced risk lowered insurance costs. Lower insurance expanded commerce increased tax revenue. And higher revenue made borrowing even easier. This created a self-reinforcing loop. The Navy did not exist to conquer territory. It existed to protect financial flows. As long as trade moved safely, capital kept circulating through London. And as long as capital moved through London, Britain remained indispensable. Empires before Britain expanded by land. Britain expanded by infrastructure. As Britain's financial system matured, the pound sterling followed. It did not become dominant because Britain was admired. It became dominant because the system left no alternative. Trade contracts were written in sterling. Insurance policies were priced in sterling. Government bonds were denominated in sterling. If you wanted access to global commerce, you needed Britain's currency. This was not coercion in the traditional sense. There were no invading armies forcing compliance. The pressure was structural. Britain had built a system where participation required alignment. And slowly, sovereignty began to shift, not from nation to nation, but from crowns to balance sheets. By the 18th century, finance and warfare were inseparable. Britain did not merely fight wars, it financed them. Allies borrowed British money to raise armies. Enemies were cut off from credit markets. Neutral states traded through British-controlled routes. Who won individual battles mattered less than who remained solvent. When cannons fired and cities burned, something quieter was happening in London. Ledgers were being updated. Interest was accumulating. Victory on the battlefield became secondary. The real power lay in being the creditor, because creditors do not need to conquer territory. They simply wait. But no system is without limits. As Britain's financial empire expanded, so did its exposure. More trade meant more dependencies. More borrowing meant greater systemic risk. The system was efficient, but fragile. Wars grew larger. Conflicts spread across continents. Debt piled higher with each generation. Britain had built a machine capable of surviving war. But it had also built a world where wars became larger than ever before. And eventually, even the most sophisticated financial system would face a test it could not contain. By the early 20th century, the foundations were strained. Global alliances were tangled in debt. Empires were interconnected through finance. A single large disruption could ripple across the entire system. When World War I erupted, it was not just a military conflict. It was a financial shock of unprecedented scale. The system Britain had perfected did not collapse immediately, but it was exposed. For the first time, the world saw the limits of financing war indefinitely, and the consequences would reshape global power forever. Britain had turned finance into empire. But in doing so, it had also created a system that no longer belonged to any single nation. Capital had learned to migrate. Credit followed stability, scale, and enforcement. The tools Britain built would eventually be used by others, on a larger scale, with greater consequences. The age of financial empires was only beginning. This is not a story about villains or heroes. It is a story about incentives. Britain did not plan to build a fragile world. It responded rationally to the pressures of its time. But systems have momentum, and once set in motion, they shape the future long after their creators are gone. Britain transformed finance into imperial infrastructure. In the rest of the video, we will see what happens when that system is pushed beyond its limits. Because when finance meant total war, the world would never be the same again. These videos take a significant amount of time and research to produce. How do you win the war and still lose the empire? In 1939, Britain still governed a vast imperial network. The pound sterling played a critical role in global trade, and the Royal Navy flew its flag across the oceans. From the outside, it still looked like undisputed power, but inside a different truth was growing. Britain's dominance no longer rested on guns and cannons, but on the resilience of its financial system. And the wars of the 20th century were the most expensive test that resilience would ever face. World War I put Britain's financial balance under irreversible strain. Taxes rose, borrowing surged, and overseas assets were sold off. For the first time, Britain was forced to take massive loans from the United States. An empire that had been the world's creditor for centuries was beginning to turn into a debtor. After the war, Britain tried to return to normal, but decisions made in the 1920s, especially those that pressured. The currency and eroded competitiveness choked the economy. On the map, the empire still looked immense, but on the balance sheet, the rope was thinning. When the new war began in 1939, Britain was already exhausted. At the peak of the conflict, a huge share of public resources flowed into defense. The entire country was mobilized. Militarily, it was a strategy for survival, but financially, it was burning through everything. And that burning wasn't just about producing tanks and aircraft. Britain was an island economy. The longer the war dragged on, the deadliest front became the supply line across the Atlantic. When ships went down, it wasn't only military cargo that disappeared. Food, fuel, and raw materials were cut off as well. That's when war stopped being something you win on the battlefield and turned into a survival problem measured in balance of payments, pressure freight costs, and insurance. By 1941, Britain was approaching a critical threshold. U.S. Lend-Lease support was vital, but it was not a free gift. It came with provisions aimed at shaping the post-war economic order and the structure of trade between the two countries. After the war, Britain was also forced to seek new financing, just to keep the economy alive, such as the 1946 Anglo-American loan. $3.75 billion at 2% interest by 1945, the picture was brutal. Britain's public debt had risen to roughly 249% of GDP. An all-time peak, this was no longer just debt. It meant strategic dependence. As the war was coming to an end, a new financial order was being built, and at the heart of that order was a single decision: the reserve currency. Think about it while people were still dying on the fronts. Somewhere else, the real spoils of war were being divided, not maps, but financial rules. Because after the war, what counted as power would no longer be decided by flags, but by which currency would sit at the center of the system. While the war was still raging, the United States and Britain met at Bretton Woods to design the post-war financial architecture. Britain, following Keynes's vision, wanted to create a neutral reserve currency. But the United States held the leverage. The dollar pegged to gold was declared the new global reserve currency. 2 centuries of sterling dominance ended overnight. The advantages of reserve currency status: virtually limitless borrowing capacity, constant global demand, low interest rates, had now shifted to America. Britain's greatest source of power had been taken from its hands. That's why Suez was never just a canal issue. At the time, Suez was one of Europe's energy arteries. Oil and trade flows were being squeezed through that choke point, and at such critical bottlenecks. The only real question isn't who controls it, but who can finance it. Because in a crisis, the decisive voice doesn't belong to the one with the stronger navy. It belongs to the one with the stronger money. When the Suez Crisis erupted in 1956, Britain made its move on the ground. But the game was no longer won on the ground. The United States applied financial pressure on the pound. Threats tied to IMF support and sterling holdings forced Britain to back down. The message of Suez was unmistakable. Without American financial approval, Britain could not act on a global scale. In 1967, the pound was devalued again. In 1976, Britain was forced to seek an IMF rescue package. An empire that had once ruled nearly a quarter of the world was now implementing the orders of international bureaucrats. The unraveling of the colonies, of course, had political and social causes, but financially the hard truth was simple. The empire had become a bill Britain could no longer pay. Britain's collapse followed a pattern: massive war-driven debt burdens, the loss of reserve currency status, persistent deficits from consuming more than it produced, currency crises and devaluations, dependence on foreign creditors, the erosion of political independence. So, why does this story matter today? Because similar mechanics still apply. In the United States as of September 2025, Total federal debt is reported at approximately $37.4 trillion, around approximately 123% of GDP. And there are analyses suggesting that in fiscal year 2025, net interest payments exceeded defense spending. And history says this: military power cannot sustain global power for long. Without financial sustainability, it took Britain 30 years to go from empire to the IMF's door. In today's hyperfast financial world, the same process could unfold much more quickly. Empires don't collapse because of moral progress. They collapse because they run out of money. Britain learned that the hard way. And now the same test may be waiting at America's door. These kinds of videos require serious research and a lot of effort. My biggest support comes from your comments and likes. If you enjoyed the video, you can support me by subscribing and leaving a like.